Welcome to Green Building Matters, the podcast that matters for green building professionals. Learn insight in green buildings as we interview today's experts in LEED and WELL. We'll learn from their career paths, war stories, and all things green, because green building matters. And now our host, and yes, he has every LEED and WELL credential. Here's Charlie Cicchetti.
Be sure to check out the Green Building Matters community, where you can have unlimited exam prep for any of the professional credential exams you're tackling next, as well as putting your continuing education on autopilot, saving time with GBS reporting your hours on your behalf. Check it out, gbes.com/join. Now, enjoy this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast, where I get to interview a green building professional every single week. Today, actually coming to us from Hawaii. Can't wait to talk to Jim Nicolow, who is the Director of Sustainability at Katerra and Lord X Sergeant, and just learn your story, Jim. How you doing today?
Doing great, Charlie.
Well, you've already given me an aloha as we started, and I just can't wait to learn more about doing sustainability in your region. But I've got to ask, where'd you grow up and where'd you go to school?
So I grew up in southwest Michigan in a small kind of rural farming community, a town called Galesburg. If you drew a line between Chicago and Detroit, Galesburg would be almost exactly equidistant. So the furthest away you could get from a big city in southwest Michigan.
And then, how... Did you know where to go to school there at University of Michigan? Did you know you wanted to get into architecture? I know those are the degrees you had. So what was that like at the time?
Yeah, I didn't think about architecture at all growing up, which is, I think, unusual a little bit in the field. A lot of the people I work with and come in contact with kind of knew from childhood that they wanted to be an architect. I hadn't considered it at all. I was actually initially interested in being a vet, and I met with a veterinarian just before starting college. And, talked to him about his career. And he said, it's as hard as medical school and less respected. So go to medical school. So I thought, okay, I'll prep for med school. I was interested in lots of different things. So for a while, I was thinking maybe computer science. I took a macroeconomics class and got really interested in economics. So was actually all kind of registered to be an econ major my sophomore year. And we were building a loft in the dorm. And we had a 2-bedroom suite. And we thought, well, if we build a loft with all 4 beds above in one bedroom and the desks below, then we could have a party room open. So we were in the process of designing and building this loft. And a guy on the hall had some great suggestions about how to structure it. And it turned out he was an architecture student. And he started talking to me about the program. And I thought, wow, that's, art and engineering. And it just seems like that seems pretty cool. So, I literally didn't come to think about architecture till partway through my college career, and kind of shifted from econ major to architecture student after a conversation with him and an intro to architecture class.
What a great story, great influence. And that's a good segue. I always like to ask, who else maybe had some influence or might you consider a mentor? Anyone else stand out?
Somebody who stands out kind of from a sustainable design and green building standpoint is Bob Berkebile from BNIM. I had kind of a political awakening when I reached college, which I think is not unusual for small farming community kids in Michigan and other places. Come to college and get exposed to lots of new ideas. So I had really kind of a budding interest in sustainability and ecological living. But I thought of it as sort of a personal thing and something you do in your personal life with the food you buy and the way you live. And that architecture as a career was sort of separate from that. And I distinctly remember Bob Berkebile coming to Ann Arbor and giving a talk to the architecture school. It would have been probably 1989 or 1990 about his epiphany for green building and how he had sort of shifted his career to focus on green building. And that was like a real light bulb for me that, wow, you could actually merge my personal interest in sustainability with a professional career. So I think a Bob Berkebile is really kind of the spark that, kind of where I first kind of realized I could put those two together.
Well, I've heard his name several times here on the podcast. I've interviewed over 150 people now, Jim, and his name has come up. So he is obviously great mentor, great influence, and kind of set you on your ways. And that's why I'm curious, when did you really know green buildings and sustainability? Obviously you have a title you've held now for a long time, Director of Sustainability, but when did you really know, okay, what I do going forward, it's going to be sustainability.
Well, after Bob's talk, I kind of tried to focus my coursework to the extent possible on green building. There really wasn't in the late 80s, early 90s at the University of Michigan College of Architecture and Urban Planning. There weren't a lot of courses around that. There were some professors who had interests in it. So to the extent I could focus a little bit in my studies, I did. But the real opportunities came when we moved to Atlanta. My wife is an epidemiologist and had a postdoc at the CDC. And so that moved us to Atlanta, we thought, for 2 years. And we ended up staying there for 8 years. When we got down to Atlanta, I saw some of the work published by Lord X. Sargent, and in particular, the Zoo Arc building, which is kind of a hobbit house of a structure, and just got very interested in the firm and ultimately went to work for Lord X. Sargent. And then that was a firm that had an interest in ecological design already, and I was able to really sort of blossom and find my way kind of through LAS. I've been there since that was 1997, so.
Unbelievable. I mean, that's where you spent almost most of all your career, and just I'm sure there's some amazing highlights, but heck of a place to work. For those listening that aren't in Atlanta like me, or then the region, or really know of your firm, tell us a little more about Lord X. Sargent and then Katerra. What do we need to know about you guys?
Sure. So LAS was in many ways a conventional architecture firm. It's common in the Southeast to have non-integrated AEs, so not just architecture. So we were architecture and planning firm basically without internal engineering, focused a lot on higher education, institutional projects. And that was really where LEED kind of initially took off. So just a nice bit of serendipity that the project types that we were working on were also early adopters for LEED. And I was the first LEED AP in the office in 2001. So those I ended up getting on those LEED projects, and that sort of led to ultimately the formal role as director of sustainability. It was informal to begin with. And then about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, Katerra approached us. They are a Silicon Valley-based technology company, ostensibly, that is looking to disrupt the design and construction industry. And we were on their design consortium, kind of helping to influence some of their early work. And they actually made overtures about becoming part of Katerra. And we ultimately decided to do that. So that's been a really interesting ride. I've expanded kind of my view of architecture from, just sustainability and architectural design to now what's really a vertically integrated company with supply chain and construction and manufacturing, and trying to get my head around all of that. And I mean, it's been a great learning opportunity after 20 years of sort of starting to feel like I knew what I was doing. Now I'm in a whole new industry, learning all over again.
New problems to solve. Well, as they say, what got us here won't get us there. 2001, your LEED AP, that's right when the exam first came out. So you were right there. And
it's funny you mentioned, I know you do green building or exam training. And at that point, there were 3 or 4 practice questions that when I took the actual first LEED AP exam, they were right there in the exam verbatim. So I felt like I had prepared well just by reading the practice exam.
That might be one of the oldest original LEED APs I've interviewed. So well done. I know credentials. We'll talk about some volunteering you've done with different committees, but let's talk buildings for a minute. On your LinkedIn profile is a building that's close to my heart, my alma mater, Georgia Tech, the Candida building, a living building. So can you tell us a little more about why that one's on your LinkedIn? You got to be proud of it. But what are some other highlights that really stand out here, Jim?
So, I mean, one of my favorites, it's still, I think one of my proudest accomplishments is right there in Atlanta as well, the South Face Eco Office. When I first moved to Atlanta in 97, I started looking for a green building community locally, and the South Face Energy Institute was really kind of the go-to organization supporting green building training and just sort of publicizing learning opportunities, all of that. So I started getting involved with South Face events and their Green Build conference Green Prints. Excuse me.
You're right.
Yeah. I think their inaugural Green Prints conference was in 97 or 98. So right as I moved to Atlanta, I started participating in that and ultimately presenting in that conference. And when their opportunity came about to design a new demonstration green office as an addition to their green residential demonstration project. We pursued that, and I was the project architect and sustainability lead on that. Dennis Creech, the executive director at the time, described it as he wanted it to be a Noah's Ark of green building features, that there was two of everything. So it wasn't just one example of a way to solve a problem. So it was the first project that I really got to work on that was completely focused on sustainability and creating a teaching building to tell the story of sustainability. Still one of my proudest achievements. It was the highest scoring LEED project in the Southeast at the time. It was certified.
What a cool story. Two of each. I love that. Yeah, for those listening, we'll put a link to southface.org. You can learn more and check out the center there. What else stands out when you look back on the highlight reel?
Our first LEED project came about through the South Face relationship, actually. There was a presentation where Dennis Creech, I think, gave a shout out to LAS for our work there. And in the audience was a National Park Service project manager who was about to start up a new project in Smoky Mountain National Park. And so that actually became, it jumped ahead of South Face because of the fundraising timeline of working with a nonprofit, and became our first LEED certified project. We did a science and education building in Smoky Mountain National Park, and have done several green buildings since with the Park Service. So I'd say that's another area, I guess, of pride and just appreciation for the opportunity to have a client that is, sustainability is kind of a key driver for their built environment projects.
Yeah. Need those clients. I mean, a lot of times we have to prove it still makes good business sense, of course, but you want the clients to know, hey, what else should we be doing? So piece together the career journey within LAS. So, were you a project architect and then you worked your way into sustainability? When did you really get tapped to be the sustainability guy?
Yeah, so it was probably about 10 years into my career before when we had an official director of sustainability. I mean, that wasn't commonly a role. When I started, it really came about organically through my interest. And I think getting the AP, frankly, pushed me up on the list of possible choices for project architects for some of those early LEED projects. I worked my way through the ranks and was managing projects ultimately. And then I think we recognized a need in the market to have sort of a dedicated sustainability expert in the firm, and to be able to sort of leverage that expertise across the firm. LAS was 45 people when I started, and we're up closer to 200 now in 6 offices. We were in 1 office when I started. So initially it was much more sort of informal and flat. We tended to have an informal green buildings studio or group that tended to work on green building projects from various practice areas. But over time, as the firm grew and as interest in LEED grew, there was a need to sort of take that subject matter expertise and spread it across the firm. So I think, I want to say maybe about 10 years in, 2007, we created a formal kind of director of sustainability, and I've been in that role since that time.
Okay, great. Tell us about geography, because you're coming to us from Hawaii. So when did you relocate there?
Yeah, so like many good architects who have a spouse in a different field, I've followed my wife's job from location to location. So we're both from Michigan originally, and we had 2 small kids in Atlanta, and had kind of the pull to be back closer to family. And she took a teaching position at Western Michigan University, which moved us back up. After 8 years in Atlanta, we moved up to Michigan. I ultimately ended up directing our Michigan office in Ann Arbor for a few years, when Terry Sargent, one of the founding partners of Lurdeck Sargent, passed away too early and unexpectedly. It was a huge loss, and he had been directing that Michigan office. So I actually helped to direct that office for a few years. And then like many Midwesterners, I think my wife had a midlife crisis, couldn't take another winter, and she applied to a position in Honolulu kind of on a whim. And 6 weeks later, she moved with my son, and I stayed behind and got the house emptied and sold, and followed them in October 2017. So we've been here now just over 3 years.
And maybe you had a head start on what we're all experiencing this year as we're recording this, and very end of 2020 and getting this episode out in early 2021 is now we really can work from anywhere, right? So it's just interesting.
Yeah, I've been working remotely since 2005, really, when we moved to Kalamazoo, because that was still 100 miles from our Ann Arbor office. So I'd go back and forth a few times a week, but primarily remotely and then with multiple offices. So yeah, I feel like it wasn't that big of a transition with COVID. It's more the sort of existential crisis of a global pandemic and the doom that's associated with it. But yeah, from a functional day-to-day standpoint, it didn't have as big an impact on me as many.
Business as usual, for sure, Jim. Well, what's keeping you busy today?
Well, you mentioned the Candida building, which is our first Living Building Challenge project. We just finished the performance period on that. It was interesting because of COVID. I mean, typically you have a year of performance data. Well, you can imagine during COVID, Georgia Tech wasn't using facilities in the way that they might typically use facilities. So it involved a fair amount of kind of surplus, extra calculations to look at what would the performance have looked at. But it looks like even under the worst cases, it's producing about 130% of the energy it needs. So performing well above the needed target. So that's pretty exciting. With the relocation to Hawaii and the addition of Katerra, I've been focusing on some projects in Hawaii recently. And in this region, we've got a Corps of Engineers project in Kwajalein Atoll at the military base there, where we're serving as sustainability consultant, and a medical clinic in Hilo on the Big Island. So that's been interesting from a time zone standpoint. So I feel like my days start Eastern and finish Hawaiian. So long days.
I've only been to Honolulu. One time I taught a LEED Green Associate class to 96 locals. This was back when there was some green job training from the last recession. So this was about 2011, 2012. And we had a great time there. It was a big class. And they told me to hurry up because they needed to go fishing. So I was like, okay, let me get through the material.
Well, sounds like we're due to get you back.
Yeah, I'd love to. I really would. This next question is, what's around the corner? What do you think we should be tracking now? What's coming up?
I mean, I don't know that I would say it's coming up. In some respects, it's here already. But I think from a broader industry standpoint, there's going to be much greater focus on embodied carbon and sort of the impact of the building materials. I feel like as an industry, we've had a good 20 years of really paying a lot of attention to operational energy and driving that down. And I think in the meantime, the codes have really caught up. I mean, I feel like LEED was an optional kind of aspirational target and the codes were far behind it. And I think over time, they've really got closer and closer to LEED. We've seen ASHRAE 90.1 kind of approach LEED. So I think those strides mean that by comparison, now the embodied carbon impact of the building products take on an ever greater importance. And then with the time value of carbon, those decisions are up front. So I think we're going to see a lot of attention to that. That was part of the appeal of Katerra, frankly. They built the largest CLT plant in North America, and they're making a big push for mass timber. And we think that's part of the future of the building industry. So that was one of the appeals to us of joining Katerra. I think health and wellness was already sort of kind of a rising interest. And I think in response to a global pandemic, it's going to be even more important. One other area that I feel like we as architects want to solve everything at the building scale. We tend to think of the building as kind of the system boundary. And, with the Living Building Challenge as an example, you've got to power it with the light that falls on the site and provide water with what falls on the site. But I often wonder if these demonstration projects are great as a thought exercise, but some of these solutions need to be municipal scale solutions where the building operator doesn't have to run an energy plant and run a water treatment plant. And it'd be much better to me if we still had distributed systems, but maybe solved some of these things at a greater scale. And I'm hoping maybe we'll start to do that, to look more comprehensively at communities rather than building by building.
I love everything you just said. I agree with it all, from the wellness to the communities. LEED for Communities is a good tool for that now too, but definitely embodied carbon, timber frame construction. I've been fortunate to work on a new project here at Atlantic Station, T3 Heinz.
Oh, sure.
Developer. And so we did the lead consulting on that, and it's just a great project. So let's go back to materials in Hawaii for a minute. So what makes sustainability more challenging there? The codes, for example, I think you have to, on the residential side, have to, solar hot water, right? Solar water heating, but power's pretty expensive there. So you're pretty incentivized to be efficient. So tell us a little bit about some projects there and what's easier and what's harder to do sustainability wise?
The costs are higher because a lot of materials are shipped in. So, I mean, just costs in general are surprisingly higher, kind of coming from a mainland perspective. What's in many respects easier is it's such a benign climate. I mean, I'm in the first house I've ever lived in that doesn't have a thermostat. There's no heating or cooling system. The most we do is close the windows if it gets a little cool at night. But so we've got a net zero energy system on our house, but it took 8 panels to get there. So it's a different, that's a different cost dynamic. The cost of electricity is extremely high, but if you're not air conditioning, you're basically looking at fans and a refrigerator.
So, it's totally different there. Well, I know that, I think everyone's a little more sustainably minded, but you're right. And when that power cost is 25 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour compared to here in Georgia, where it's, 8 to 11 cents, it's just different. It's a different driver.
Well, and in some respects, it should be more expensive like that. I mean, the reality is that cost of per kW in Georgia it has some externalized costs of pollution from the grid that's providing it. So you're paying for it in other ways, but it makes it really hard to do those trade-offs and justify sustainability measures. We're working on a project for the National Park Service in St. Croix, and I think their electric rates were 50 cents a kilowatt hour. So solar wasn't a 10-year payback. I think it was an under 3-year payback. And when you have those more expensive utility costs, it really changes the ROI on some alternative technologies.
Absolutely. And that's like you said earlier, the price on carbon, even if it's just us projects putting a price on carbon. Okay, so let's talk a little more about you. What do you think you're really good at? What's your specialty or gift?
I think that I don't like buildings. I mean, I say that. I mean, it's somewhat in truth. It's funny when I think of most of my colleagues when they plan vacations, they'll go to see buildings, and it would never dawn on me to plan a vacation around seeing a building. I usually lament, a building's impact on the natural environment. So I really appreciate green building and I appreciate well-designed buildings, but in some respects, not being passionate about the object of a building as an architect puts me in kind of a funny place, but maybe a helpful place when you're talking about sustainable design.
No, that is interesting perspective. And it sounds like you like to problem solve, you like to improve, and of course the industry, but building by building, it's a building. Let's really just figure out a better way to do what we're doing. So that's what I'm kind of hearing here. Do you have any good habits, Jim? Any routines or rituals?
Not that I can think of. I mean, I feel like I'm pretty traditional in the way that I work. I've got a handwritten to-do list on, that I keep updated with dates of deliverables on my left. My email is my surrogate memory. So I tend to rely on that to know what I'm doing. I guess one thing I would say that maybe is important for people, particularly in the time of COVID, is I've had to learn to be deliberate about informal conversation and communication with colleagues from a remote work setting. You don't have those sort of inadvertent, water cooler discussions, and you can't have them when you're in different locations. So making a point sometimes of reaching out to team members just to check in and talk when there's not a set agenda item, I think is something that I've done, I've learned to do over time working remotely, and something that may be applicable to more folks now in this new sort of COVID world.
The new world. No, thanks for that. Let's talk bucket list. I mean, some people like to travel to Hawaii, but you live there. So where else would you like to venture to one day or travel? Or is there still something, even professionally, you want to achieve? So what are one or two things maybe on the bucket list?
On the bucket list, from a travel standpoint, I'd love to see Iceland. We had a trip planned to Iceland in June of this year. Of course, that didn't happen. So I have an entire itinerary and agenda mapped out for a 2-week trip to Iceland that I hope to actually be able to implement at some point. Professionally, I mean, I feel like in many respects it's a dream. I have a dream job. I mean, I've been able to focus my career on sustainable design for a firm that values sustainability. So in many respects, I feel like that's a bucket list item achieved. And I feel like some of it's just dumb luck being in the right place at the right time with the right interests, but I'm really appreciative of that. I'd like to learn to surf. I've been in Hawaii for 3 years yet, and what I do on the water would not be mistaken by anyone for surfing. So that's on my bucket list. I'd love to actually know how to surf. It seems like a nice low carbon entertainment activity here.
Great bucket list item. That's fun, man. Let's talk books and learning. I don't know if you like to pick up a book in your hands or listen to Audible, or if you do some industry publications, but is there a book or two you'd recommend?
Yeah, I tend to prefer books in hand just because so much of work is on a screen. I don't read things electronically. Typically, I have a subscription to the local paper and I read the hard copy daily. I was thinking about books, and one that I've been working my way through, I think with my short attention span, maybe because of COVID, it's taking me longer to finish books than it used to. But I've been reading Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. It's the description is a brief history of tomorrow. So it's kind of looking at the future of humanity. Really interesting kind of look at our species kind of transitioning to a more technological age, and what does that mean? I was looking back at the beginning of the book that I read before COVID, and he had this whole section called The Last Days of Death. And it was about this idea that maybe we were moving towards a point of immortality, which is certainly ironic, having a global pandemic spring up after reading that section. But it's a really kind of thought-provoking book that I'm still working my way through. It reminded me a bit of something my wife has always said about this sort of focus on sustainability and trying to deliberately, steer the built environment towards a more benign or ultimately beneficial place in the environment. Her take as a epidemiologist from a public health perspective is, well, if these things get too far out of balance, they're self-correcting and, there'll be a pandemic. And I mean, she had said this years ago, and I just think, wow.
Thought-provoking, that book. We're going to put the links in the show notes here. I always love just to hear these recommendations. And you have a great point about all our screen time and just, man, how can we change that up and get up and move around more? It's just so important. Anything else before we kind of talk career advice, Jim? Any passion projects, anything that, you've really been spending more time on that someone listening here might be interested in?
Gosh, that's a great question. I feel like that it's a perennial challenge, and I'm still trying to figure out how to solve it with our organization, especially as we're now a bigger organization than before. But it's always that line between, the small percentage of projects that sustainability is a key driver, and it's what the project is about. And you can do great things like the Eco Office or the Candida building or, the projects for the Park Service. And the other maybe 80% of projects, which sustainability isn't even a stated goal necessarily, and how can you get a baseline attention to sustainability in a consistent and comprehensive way across an organization where people feel like it's their job and part of what they do. There's a weird mix or a weird effect to me with creating a sustainability director. It's great that you have the subject matter expertise, but there's also a risk of people thinking, well, it's not my job. It's the sustainability director's job to worry about that stuff. So I think that's it's a perennial challenge figuring out how to get this stuff to sort of percolate and just be part of what we do.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. If you look back on the career, any other advice? That was great. Anything else that you wish you'd have just known earlier in your career?
I think you hear it when you're starting out and even before you choose a career, but people always tell you it's important that you do what you like. And I think that's really true. I mean, I think people perform at their highest when they're doing something that they're invested in and that they care about. And I feel like I've been very fortunate that I've been able to align my professional career with where my personal interest and passion is. I mean, being an architect that's not crazy about buildings is sort of set me up for failure. But I've been fortunate enough to find a way through it that, I can get meaning out of the work and enjoy the work. So I think it's really critical. It's almost cliche, but it's really critical to sort of know what your passions are and understand yourself and try to be true to and honor those, because that's where you'll do your best work and great things will happen.
That's exciting. it sounds like this new challenge with Katerra and just what's the future of buildings and construction look like. It's really got you on your toes thinking and problem solving. It must be a lot of fun. So let's say there's someone listening right now as we come to a close here. Jim, I've enjoyed your enthusiasm, getting to know you, and just, get this Atlanta connection and this Candida connection. But if someone's listening, but they're just now jumping into the green building movement, it's been good to you. Any words of encouragement for them?
Yeah, I mean, get involved in professional organizations like the local USGBC, the local AIA, whatever your profession. There are organizations like that. I had in Kalamazoo, there was a sustainable business forum that I joined and worked on the board of that. So just finding those opportunities, because from a professional opportunity standpoint, that's where you network and build your professional network. It brings you new skills. I feel like you get so much more out than what you put into it. And I didn't really get involved in organizations like that until a little bit later in my career. I think I had some early work with the AIA COAT chapter in Atlanta. And that's what really sort of opened my world to sustainability opportunities in Atlanta. So take advantage of those professional service organizations. It seems like you're giving them something, but in reality, you get way more out of it than what you put into it.
Oh, great career advice there. Get involved. Surround yourself with like-minded people and just put yourself out there. But so everyone, this has been Jim Nicolow. He's the Director of Sustainability at Katerra and Lord Sergeant. He's in Hawaii. He's a LEED Fellow. Jim, thanks for your time today. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Charlie. It was really fun.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At gbes.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.